I'm Steve Shamraz, the reporter who put together the story on the stolen life, and this is our executive producer back in the I-Team, Tanya Simpson. And the reason I wound up doing this story, it's her fault in the first place.
Yeah, so our story ideas, we look for them in a bunch of different places. We get emails, we get calls, we get tips. I am also a huge fan of just looking through court documents, as odd as it sounds. And so I was doing that one day, looking at some federal court indictments.
It was the week before Christmas. It's kind of the slow period, so what else are you going to do?
Yeah, go through court documents. And one particular stood out to me because one of the charges was voter fraud. So of course that piqued my interest because Steve had just done a series of stories about voter issues, and one of them was about voter fraud and
Right.
if dead people actually vote.
I spent, I don't know how many hours over the course of a couple weeks looking for dead voters. We looked at 800-some thousand voting records from 2012 presidential election across Wisconsin, and we found zero. We got bupkis, nothing that showed a dead person had voted. And Tanya walks over to my desk in the middle of the afternoon and says, I have a dead voter.
I said, you're never going to believe what I found, Steve. And he's like, what are you talking about? And I said, I found a dead voter. And he says, no way.
So the first thing I do is I take the name of the person who's alleged to have been dead and have voted, and I go back to our records that we used for the story in November. I plug the name in, nothing. Doesn't even show up. And it turns out that was an indicator that we had stumbled on a story much bigger than just one person committing in-person voter fraud in the name of somebody who died. And that's how we discover the story of the stolen life. And that life belongs to...
That life belonged to a young boy who lived in Cudahy, who died at a very young age. But we didn't really discover who that young boy was until Steve started doing some digging.
This is the indictment here that was walked over to my desk, the one afternoon the week before Christmas, and it only mentions this boy by his initials, JB, and that he died when he was 12 years old in 1957. And thankfully it was the week before Christmas. It was kind of a slow week, so I jumped right into that. I went through, I don't want to know how many archives of the Milwaukee Journal and the Milwaukee Sentinel back in the day, looking for 12-year-old boys who died in 1957. And we found this. This was the obituary, and this was the name we got, James Jimmy Belisle, JB, born in 1957. And in the death notice in the paper, there were the names of 5 siblings. So our scramble then became, okay, let's reach out to this family and see if we can find somebody who's, number one, still alive, and number two, in the area that we could talk to about this. And how many dead ends did you run into?
I ran into about 4. So I found some siblings who were also deceased. I found some people who had the exact same name as a sibling, but actually were not related to Jimmy, including the fire and police commissioner of a small Wisconsin town.
We were even pronouncing the last name wrong for a while because somebody that we thought could have been a relative told us the name was
Bell.
Bell. But Belisle is how it's pronounced. And I got that because I found Jimmy's brother, who was younger than Jimmy and was 2 years old at the time Jimmy died. And the brother was great, very gracious on the phone with us, thankful that we brought this to their attention, that all this had happened, but said, you really want to talk to my sister. My sister helped raise Jimmy. And so that took us all the way up to Appleton and the home of Ginny, Virginia, she likes to go by Ginny, who really shared the story of little Jimmy.
And while that part of the story was being worked on, concurrently we had the name and address of the person who was accused of stealing Jimmy's life. So we got to do a little undercover work too. We went over to that address and staked it out for a couple days to see if this guy was still there, what he looks like. And we found him. We were very surprised we found him. And we decided to go ask him. Like, what can you tell us about this?
Well, because what we want to know is how David Urkel, who's accused of stealing the life of Jimmy Belisle. This is Jimmy, by the way. He's in a wheelchair here. He had muscular dystrophy, and that's what took his life at 12 years old. How did David Urkel and James Belisle run into each other? How did one know about the other? And it turns out that David Urkel lives in Cudahy, just a couple blocks. I mean,
Yeah,
no
less than a mile.
No more than a mile away from where Jimmy Belisle was born and died. So the family doesn't know for sure, that there was so much publicity about little Jimmy back in the 50s in a tight little community like Cudahy, that people remembered the name. And in 1985, the federal prosecutors say David Urkel, remembering that name, applied for a Social Security card in James Belisle's name, and then for 30-some years lived the life of a little boy who died at 12 years old.